Okay, so we are looking at our day 12 final exam review here for PFT 118. So we're going to go a little bit over the cardiorespiratory system into our digestive system, which will allow us to talk a little bit about like nutrition, and we'll finally end everything up with a little bit of information on metabolism. So our cardiorespiratory system, right, is going to be a support system that sort of provides fuel for all the other systems of the body, right? It is delivering all of these nutrients throughout. And so it's a support system responsible for providing the tissues of the human body with oxygen, nutrients, and of course, protective agents, right? It also provides a means by which you can remove waste products, which your body is constantly making. So as we are looking at this, right, we've got our cardiovascular system, which is your heart, your blood, and your blood vessels. And we've got your respiratory system, which is working intimately with that cardiovascular system to gather things like oxygen and allow those to get into our actual bloodstream. So when we look at the cardiovascular system, right, we are talking about the heart, your blood, and your blood vessels here. So if we're looking at the heart, this is the muscular pump that sort of powers the entire cardiovascular system, right? It's going to be this big four-chambered muscular organ that has the ability to allow blood in and then pump that blood out. And so in order to do that, it has to have like gathering sites for blood, and it has to have like pumping sites for blood. And so your atriums are sort of acting like your gathering sites, and those ventricles are acting as like the pumping sites. And so when you look at those chambers, right, your atria are the chambers of the heart that gather blood as it returns to the heart, whether it's returning from the body where it's already delivered all of its oxygen, or if it's returning from the lungs where it has sort of picked up some oxygen. So the right atrium is going to gather blood that is low in oxygen because that's all the blood that's returning from the body. This is also going to house your SA node. Your SA node lives in the right atrium there, and that's the pacemaker of the heart. So your heart is really good at generating its own electric signal in order to kind of control its contraction rhythm. And so the SA node is actually in charge of that. Then you've also got your left atrium, which is going to gather blood that's very high in oxygen because the left atrium is getting blood right as it's returned from the lungs. So you've got the right atrium gathering blood from the lungs. You've got your your left atrium gathering blood from the lungs, and your right atrium gathering blood coming back from the body. I was trying to reverse which side, and I got the camera flipped around, so it goofed me up for a second. Then you get your ventricles, right? Your ventricles are going to pump blood away. So once it drops from the atrium into your ventricles, that's where that blood's going to get pumped out, either to the lungs to go pick up some oxygen, or to the body to deliver that oxygen. So your ventricles act as the chambers that pump blood away from the heart. The right ventricle is pushing low oxygen blood to the lungs so that it can get oxygen, drop off all of its CO2. And the left ventricle pushes oxygen throughout the body in order to deliver all of those oxygen nutrients. So that's sort of the chambers of the heart. Now, when we measure like how well or how unwell your heart is functioning, we're going to use a term called your cardiac output. And that's the overall performance of your heart. It's how much blood you pump out of your heart per minute, right? So in order to understand like how much blood is pumped per minute, we have to have two separate concepts for those. We've got your stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped per beat, and we've got the number of beats per minute, which is your heart rate, which is the number of beats in 60 seconds. So those two things come together to make up the overall performance of your heart, which is your cardiac output. Now, again, we've been talking about it already, but the entire purpose of your cardiovascular system is to pump blood throughout your body, which is this really cool sort of liquid connective tissue made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, water, lymphocytes, all these different things. But the one that we spend a lot of our time talking about are red blood cells, which are specialized cells that have hemoglobin in them, which is this really cool little protein that binds to oxygen. And so that's actually how your blood is delivering those oxygen nutrients throughout the body. It's using hemoglobin in order to be able to do that. And then your heart has to be able to like actually get that blood to be able to travel where it needs to go. And that's where your blood vessels come in. So your blood vessels are these hollow tubes that run throughout your body and act as the transportation vessels for your blood to travel throughout. And so the three main types of that are going to be your arteries, capillaries, and veins. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Capillaries are the exchange sites, and veins carry blood back towards the heart. You've also got your coronary arteries, which are kind of cool. These are specialized arteries that are supplying the heart itself with blood, because at the end of the day, your heart is still a tissue and it still needs to get its own delivery of nutrients. And so your coronary arteries are allowing that to happen. So that's your cardiovascular system in a nutshell. If we look at your respiratory system, right, this is going to be made up of two sections: your respiratory pump and your respiratory passageways. The pump is in the thoracic cavity. This gives you like flexibility, but also a framework. These are things like your diaphragm is pumping things into and out of your lungs. Your ribs are allowing you to kind of expand, but then they're heavy, so they push things down, push air out of your lungs. And so that's your respiratory pump. But a lot of times we're going to spend our time talking about your respiratory passageways, which are these really cool little tubes that run throughout your respiratory system and allow oxygen to travel into smaller and smaller and smaller areas until eventually they get all the way down to these little what are called alveoli, and that's where all that oxygen is interacting with your blood. And so your respiratory passageways that you've got are going to be your bronchi, which are these two primary branches that travel down your throat and then split into two different sections. Those two sections are inside of your lungs. Those bronchi split into what are called bronchioles, which are small branches that eventually end in these little popcorn-shaped sacs called alveoli, and they are covered in capillaries. That allows you to experience gas exchange. And so when we're talking about gas exchange, we are either talking about an internal gas exchange or an external gas exchange. Both, whether it's internal or external, are happening because of capillaries covering different types of tissues. So if it's an external gas exchange, that's happening in your lungs, where you're exchanging oxygen and other nutrients, oxygen and waste products particularly, with the external environment, right? So that's why it's an external exchange. So oxygen is going to leave the lungs and enter your capillaries because it's moving from the outside environment in the air into your red blood cells inside of your body. Meanwhile, CO2, which has just been carried up to the lungs, is going to move from the blood cell into the lungs and then be exhaled out. And so you are exchanging during external gas exchange at the lungs carbon dioxide for oxygen. You are dropping off carbon dioxide and picking up oxygen. At an internal gas exchange, the exact same thing is happening, but in reverse. Instead, your body is exchanging oxygen for CO2. And so it's actually picking up CO2 from your tissues because they used up all the oxygen. So now they're exhaling CO2 waste products. And so CO2 leaves the tissue and enters the red blood cell, while oxygen leaves the red blood cell and enters the tissue. And that's why that's an internal exchange. That's happening at a tissue level. So external exchange is happening at the lungs. Internal exchange is happening at a tissue level. Now, we already talked a little bit about how your cardiovascular system works with your respiratory system. Well, a big part of that depends on like what direction your blood is traveling. And so there is your pulmonary circuit and your systemic circuit. We either need to get oxygenated blood to all the tissues of the body, or we need to get deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that it can become oxygenated. So your pulmonary circuit is responsible for pumping blood to the lungs so that it can gather oxygen. Then we want to be able to pump that blood throughout the body, and that's where your systemic circuit comes in. So the pulmonary circuit is working with the lungs. The systemic circuit is working with all the systems of the rest of the body. One of those systems that's most important is going to be your digestive system, which is a support system in the body that breaks down nutrients into usable energy. And so your digestive system is the process of mechanically and chemically breaking stuff down. That's the main purpose of your digestive system, right? So digestion is breaking stuff down. Absorption is the other part of your digestive system, which is allowing nutrients to pass from an external environment to an internal environment, very similar to your lungs. So we are getting things like nutrients to pass into our blood. So absorption is the process allowing those into our actual bloodstream. Now, your digestive tract is this big, long series of tubes that allows you to have all this area to break all these materials down. And so that tract is a hollow tube that allows food to be able to be transported throughout the body. This is sometimes called the alimentary canal or your gastrointestinal tract. There's a lot of different names for it, but they all mean the same thing. Your mouth is the very beginning of it, and this is where the process of ingestion takes place. This is where you're first bringing food from outside of your body to almost inside of your body. Now, in your mouth, you produce all kinds of different materials. One of the most important ones is called salivary amylase. This is actually an enzyme in your saliva that helps you break down carbohydrates into disaccharides. So it takes something that's very complex and starts the process of digestion by breaking it down into something slightly smaller. Then all that food, which has been somewhat broken down, it's kind of a wet, mushy substance now, is going to drop into your stomach. And that wet, mushy substance is now going to sit in this little J-shaped pouch that is full of hydrochloric acid, which is going to chemically break your food down even further, until eventually it's not just like a wet paste. Now it is like a wet soup. You know, it's nothing but just individual little tiny pieces, with the exception of a few fats, and a few carbohydrates here. And so then once that nice wet soupy mixture is fully broken down, it's going to move into your small intestine. So a lot of the heavy lifting of digestion took place here. There's going to be a little bit more digestion that takes place here in the small intestine, but this is where we are officially ready to start the other process of our digestive system, which is absorption. So your small intestine is a long hollow tube that's primarily responsible for absorbing nutrients. Still part of the entire canal, right? But we've sort of switched like what we are doing. And so your small intestine is a series of all these little folds that we call lumen. And on those lumen, there are all these little projections called villi. And villi are these little microscopic folds that are filled with blood vessels. And those blood vessels have small holes in them that allow nutrients to pass into your bloodstream, very similarly to how your alveoli acted as the exchange site for gases. This is acting as an exchange site for nutrients, except it's not really trading anything in exchange. It's kind of just taking stuff in. And then you have all your microvilli, which kind of live on the villi, and they're the little hairs that make sure that those nutrients don't get stuck anywhere and, you know, go to the right holes. Once you're done absorbing most of your food, you're going to be left with nothing but fibers and wastes. And that's where that food, or what is left of that food, is going to pass into your large intestine. So your large intestine is the final part of your digestive tract, right? This is the final part of the GI tract. And this is where a little bit more absorption is going to take place. But for the most part, your small intestine did most of that heavy lifting. But it's going to absorb a little bit of water, a little bit of electrolytes, and some final materials there until you are really left with nothing that is supposed to like provide you with actual food and energy. Now, instead, you are simply left with waste products. And so now that food can move out of its body. Now, all of this process of like digestion took place. This was the entire canal. And some of the things that help us break stuff down need to be secreted into that canal. And that's where your accessory organs come in. These are organs that are attached to your digestive tract that will secrete materials to aid in the process of digestion. So for instance, your liver is an accessory organ that does a lot of different things inside of your body. It produces this material called bile, which helps you break down fats. And so bile will be created by the liver and then stored in this other little accessory organ called your gallbladder. And then your gallbladder will drop this material called bile into your small intestine. That bile is this chemical that helps your body break down fats. So your liver makes it, it stores it in the gallbladder, and your gallbladder drops it off into your small intestine. So those are how those accessory organs sort of work with the alimentary canal. One fun little fact about your liver as well is that it also stores glycogen, which aids in raising your glucose levels if your glucose levels ever get too low. How do you know if your glucose levels are low, or why did your glucose levels get so low? Well, that's where we have to start talking about, rather than just looking at digestion, we got to look at nutrition, right? And so nutrition is going to be the processes by which we take in food and use that food in order to do it. Like we just went through the whole process of breaking everything down. Why did we do that if we're not going to use it? Well, we are going to use it. This is how we do that. So nutrition is usually broken down in terms of how much energy you need. Obviously, the whole point of digestion and absorption is to break things down so that you have enough fuel to run your body. So your daily energy needs is the amount of energy required in order to keep your body running. And we measure this in a unit called calories. So calories in their upper and lowercase versions. Is a regular uppercase calorie is the one that we often see. This is the amount of heat energy required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. So if you had a kilogram of water and you put a hamburger underneath that water and lit it on fire, if the temperature of that water raised 100 degrees, there would be 100 calories in that hamburger. It's a pretty freaking lean hamburger. Then we've also got calories with a lowercase c, which is the same thing. We know a kilogram is 1,000 grams of water. So lowercase calorie is the amount of heat energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water instead of 1 kilogram of water. Fair warning to everybody on the final, I don't know which version of the calorie they are going to send you, but I do know there's a calorie question in there. So make sure you pay attention to whether it's a kilo for 1,000 grams or a regular just gram, in which case it would be lowercase c. Now, you obviously are going to burn a different amount of energy than I am, and I'm going to burn a different amount of energy than my parents. Like, we're all going to burn different amounts of energy than each other. And so we have to be able to sort of come up with a version of measuring that energy. And that's where we start to look at our total daily energy expenditure, right? This is the estimation of how many calories you burn on an average day. And it's made up of 3 primary components: your resting metabolism, which is the number of calories you burn at your base; your thermic effect of food, which is the amount of calories that you burn processing different foods; and your thermic effect of activity, which is any extra energy that you burn by living your lifestyle. You know, like your resting metabolic rate would be how many calories you burn if you were in like a coma, but if you're standing up, you know, there would be calories beyond that number. That's where the thermic effect of activity comes in. So let's say I burn 1,800 calories at rest, but I actually burn, 1,700 calories, I'm sorry, 2,000 calories over the course of a day. That additional like 300 is my thermic effective activity. And if it's only 300, it means I've barely been moving for the day. So that would be pretty low. But this makes up about 75% of your caloric burn, so that's not too surprising. By the way, this is also sometimes referred to as your basal metabolic rate as well, which is basically the same thing. It's just measured ever so slightly differently. So you'll probably see those two used interchangeably. Now, it isn't always just about calories. Sometimes it's also about, like, you know, making sure your metabolism can work the way it's supposed to. And in order to do that, we also have to make sure we're eating the right amount of nutrients. And so we have 6 types of nutrients. You have your macronutrients, which are the ones you need lots of; your micronutrients, which are the ones you need very little of; and your water, which is, you know, incredibly, incredibly important. So your macronutrients consist of proteins, fats, and carbs. Proteins are responsible for repairing your body tissue and structures, right? They're basically these big complex chains of what we call amino acids. And amino acids are made of the same building blocks as your other nutrients, fats and carbs, but they've got a little bit of extra nitrogen, which gives them these kind of 20 unique shapes. We'll look at those shapes in just a second. So they're going to provide 4 calories for every gram of protein you have, and they should be about 10 to 35% of your total caloric intake. Now, like I said, you have all these amino acids. You need to make sure that you have all 20 amino acids if your body is going to be able to assemble a new protein. And so we have these terms that we refer to as complete proteins or incomplete proteins, or sometimes you'll see the term complementary proteins. And they're basically just describing the food. Like, hey, like if you said I'm getting a complete protein, what you're really saying is, like, I got a food that has all of my amino acids in it. So complete proteins are protein sources that contain all of your amino acids. Typically, we think of animal sources, right? You know, this is coming from like an animal's body, so it assembled all those proteins, whether it's like, you know, an animal's tissue or an egg or milks or things like that. Those were assembled by an animal's body. And so those are what we consider a complete protein because they've got all of the amino acids in them. Incomplete proteins are proteins that are missing one or more. These are typically plant-based sources, although not all plants are incomplete and not all, or some plants can be complete. For instance, quinoa is a really good example of a complete protein that is a grain. But these are typically plant-based sources that are missing one or more amino acids. So because an animal body didn't assemble these proteins, they're missing, one or more amino acids, or they just have really hyper low levels of those amino acids. Now, you can totally eat only plant-based sources and create what are called complementary proteins. And complementary proteins are sources where you create a complete amino acid profile by filling in each other's gaps. Beans and rice are a really good example of this, right? This is missing a few amino acids. This is missing a few amino acids, but the ones that this one are missing are filled in by rice and vice versa. So they complement each other to make a complete protein. Our next macronutrient we got to look at is carbohydrates. These are really important for energy production, but these act as the chief source of energy for basically most of your metabolism. They're big complex chains of what we call monosaccharides, which are basically a sugar. And they provide you 4 calories for every gram of energy. You should be getting about 45 to 65% of your total intake from carbohydrates every day in terms of calories. That's going to ensure that you have enough energy to live your life. You're also going to have 25 to 35 grams of fiber in your diet as well, in order to make sure that if your body didn't digest something properly, that fiber can go through your body and pull any of those materials out of your digestive system. So the 3 main types of carbohydrates that we've got are going to be monosaccharides, which is a single sugar molecule, disaccharides, which is a double sugar molecule, and polysaccharides, which is many, 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 many sugar molecules. The 2 most common versions that you are going to find of polysaccharides are going to be things like starches or fibers. The reason you can't break fiber down is because it is so complex. It is so many different sugar molecules. Your body doesn't really have the tools necessary to chemically break it down. And that's a good thing because it passes through your body and keeps things from sitting around causing harm. Now, you've also got lipids, which are fats in your diet. These are going to have the most energy per gram at 9 calories per gram versus 4 that we saw in proteins and carbs. And they should be about 20 to 35% of your total caloric intake. The 2 main types of fats that you're going to consume are either going to be saturated fatty acids or unsaturated fatty acids. Saturated are often associated with animal sources. Again, your body stores things in the form of saturated fat, but you also have unsaturated fatty acids in your diet, which are typically these liquid sources found in plants. These are typically considered your healthy fats. These are typically considered unhealthy, but remember, saturated fat is still important. You just want it to only be about 10% of your total calories. Water, the most important nutrient that is ensuring the transportation of materials throughout your body, balancing your pH, helping with your temperature. Very, very important, but it also allows you to perform metabolism, right? And that's why this is the most essential nutrient, so that you can do this process called hydrolysis, which is basically a molecule of water shoving itself between other molecules to break them up. So if you had a disaccharide, for instance, hydrolysis would turn that double sugar molecule, it would break it and turn it into 2 single sugar molecules. So very, very important there. Then you also have your micronutrients. These are going to aid in metabolism, but also give your body structure. These are your vitamins and minerals, right? So vitamins aid in the utilization of minerals. They also help you metabolize certain materials, and minerals are inorganic elements that aid in certain physiologic processes, such as action potentials and giving your body structure, such as in your skeletal system. So we've been talking about metabolism. What do I mean, right? Well, we're talking about any and all chemical reactions that take place in the body. And so when we're studying metabolism, we usually use this term called bioenergetics, which is a term that describes how we transform energy through different chemical and biochemical reactions, right? So how do I take a steak dinner and turn it into a little bit new muscle, but also like enough energy to go for a run? That's going to be part of bioenergetics. So then we also have a special term that we refer to as your exercise metabolism, which is really where we spend most of our time. And this is describing how we use bioenergetics and metabolism in the unique situations of exercise. And so when we're describing that, because exercise is such a high energy activity, we have to talk about energy production. And that's where we understand what a molecule of ATP is, or adenosine triphosphate. This is the primary source of energy inside of your body. And so your body uses this molecule of ATP to break it and release all of its energy, capture that energy, and do work. So that's what we're talking about when we say ATP. How do you make ATP? Well, primarily you're either going to do that in an oxygenated environment or a non-oxygen environment. And so your anaerobic ATP production is a non-oxygen environment. This is things like a process called glycolysis, where your body takes in glucose, breaks it down, and converts it into ATP. And it does it without the aid of oxygen. Now, if you throw a little bit of oxygen in there, your body can now take that glucose and add a little bit of oxygen to it, and now it can produce way more ATP, and that's where your aerobic or oxidative metabolism comes in. This is very complex, and because it actually uses the byproducts of your anaerobic metabolism. So if you start doing something and you've been doing it for about 10 seconds, you're primarily in that glycolysis process. Let's say you continue doing that activity for another 40 seconds or so, you're still going to be in that glycolysis, but then you want to keep doing that activity for maybe a couple hours, and that's where your aerobic metabolism is going to come in. Once you've built up enough byproducts with your anaerobic metabolism, your aerobic metabolism can start bringing in some oxygen and spitting out a whole bunch of ATP. So that is a review of everything from the second half of this class. I hope you guys found it enlightening. I will be posting this video up on Canvas here in just a little bit. And you'll find your homework in this section as well. So break legs, everybody, and I will see you in a bit.